We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
Work on a strategic cooperation agreement between Russia and Iran is in its final stage. Also, senators press against President Biden's refusal to label Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is kicking off its festivities in Uzbekistan. Joining us now to discuss this and more, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and a researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
The leaders of the SCO member countries are expected to discuss a wide range of topics, such as strengthening the organization's capabilities in security and stability. Dr. Horne, your thoughts on the SCO? Looks like a new world order is on the move.
I think we're living through a period without peer, given the past 500 years. And I think that that's no exaggeration. You are correct to suggest that a new international order is emerging before our very eyes. On the one hand, you see what could only be called a kind of deindustrialization of certain nations in Western Europe, led by Germany, at the behest of the United States, following Washington over the cliff in Ukraine. At the same time, you see not only the rise of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization led by China and Russia, but you have a number of other nations beating down their door in order to join. Iran, for example. Also pay attention to the lengthy article that appeared in the New York Times just today, September 15th, 2022, about Saudi Arabia, an erstwhile U.S. ally, edging ever closer to Moscow, particularly in the formation called OPEC+, that is to say, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries plus Russia, which is developing a stranglehold over energy sources, which, as you know, is the key to why the German economy and many other Western European economies are doing so poorly, because of their attempt to break connections with Russia over energy. At the same time, you have an allied organization, speaking of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And once again, other nations are beating down their door in order to join. I'm thinking of Turkey. I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, perhaps. I'm thinking of Argentina for sure. And what's interesting about that is that if you look at the economies of the SCO and the BRICS, particularly if you look at the Chinese economy, just to focus on that for a second. The Financial Times of London had a piece just the other day that suggested that China alone is supplying more capital to friendly nations than the International Monetary Fund. Likewise, with regard to construction projects, it's supplying more capital than the World Bank. So we are on the cusp of a new international order. What I fear, I'm afraid to say, is that even though this is generally good news for the international community, and particularly for the global South, given the rulers in Washington and the strength of the right wing in this country and the growth of neo-fascist tendencies, I'm not sure if the prospects, I'm afraid to say, for those of us who are trapped behind the cotton curtain, look very promising.
To your point about China providing more capital than the World Bank as well as the IMF, they're also providing capital at better rates. So less usatory rates than both of those other international or United States-backed funding sources. And when we look at the direction that the global South is going, and we look at this SCO and the countries involved there, they're all dealing economically while the United States is selling more weapons to Taiwan and trying to pick fights with other countries that are closely related to some of the ones that we've mentioned. So all of that to ask, what's the United States response to this new world order other than militarism?
Well, I think you have a point, and certainly I think when historians of the future, assuming we have a future given this bristling arms industry in the United States, but looking back, they will probably see August 2022 as a kind of turning point. I'm speaking of the adventuristic trip of Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan, followed by a delegation led by the liberal Massachusetts U.S. Senator Ed Markey, followed by a delegation led by the conservative Republican senator from Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn. I think that sent a signal to Beijing. It was a shot across the bow. And at the same time, you had the passage and the signing into law of the so-called CHIPS Act, which is seeking to hedge with regard to computer chips important for everything from cars to the phone/computers that you carry in your pocket, with that industry currently dominated by TSMC, one of the most profitable and lucrative corporations on planet Earth, happening to be sited in Taiwan. There was a fear that if China does move on its rebel province, that TSMC would fall into China's hand, and it would be game over for U.S. imperialism, given U.S. imperialism is dependent upon computer chips from TSMC. And so China, it seems to me, has drawn the appropriate conclusion that Washington, U.S. imperialism, is seeking regime change in Beijing. I don't think that that's any secret. Just like we also know that U.S. imperialism is not only seeking regime change in Moscow, they're seeking to break up the country because it has been decided that the only way the North Atlantic countries can survive and thrive is by having a Yeltsin-type regime in Moscow. That does not seem to be in the cards at the moment, and so therefore Washington wants to bring that into being. But at the same time, they've made a strategic blunder because they've driven China and Russia closer together. They have ignored what Henry Kissinger, the former U.S. Secretary of State, said. He, of course, was responsible 50-odd years ago for driving a wedge between Moscow and Beijing, which, contestation to the contrary, was largely responsible for the weakening of the Soviet Union and its going out of existence in 1991. And so this China-Russia dyad is quite formidable. And I don't think U.S. imperialism has an answer, except, of course, throwing more fuel on the flame.
When you mention the United States preferring a Yeltsin-type regime in Russia, does that also bring with it the neoliberal policies that the United States was trying to impose or bring to Russia at the time of the Yeltsin period?
Oh, clearly it does. And as you gentlemen know more than most, Washington seems to veer. Once it was just foreign policy, now it's domestic policy, from imposing neoliberalism to imposing neo-fascism. Those seem to be the only cards that this one-trick pony knows how to play.
RT reports U.S. openly a party to Ukraine conflict, and they say it's a cause for deep concern. But what's interesting is when you read further down the article, it says, even so, this will not lead to real change on the battlefield. Only naive, short-sighted politicians who know history poorly can talk about victory over Russia. And they say Russia's mission is to, quote, lay down the foundations of a multipolar world and send the American rules-based world order into the dustbin of history. Moscow's diplomats have no doubt they will achieve this. Your thoughts on all of that? That's a mouthful there, Dr. Horne.
Well, I think that the commentator was drawing a reasonable inference from the recent trip of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to Ukraine, where he announced another $1 billion package. But what eluded and evaded the attention of many journalists on this side of the Atlantic writing about that is that about half of that package was going to Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, to Moldova, to Bulgaria. In other words, it's not unreasonable to infer that Washington might want to conduct a multi-pronged offensive against Russia from those aforementioned countries, particularly since the conflict in Ukraine is not going well. Read here the unwillingness of President Biden to spike the football and do an end zone dance in light of the Ukrainian counter-offensive in Kharkiv. And reference here also the recent statement by a prominent parliamentarian in Georgia, the Russian neighbor, that Georgia should consider waging war against Russia. So once again, this is playing with fire. Once again, it seems that Washington has imbibed the unfortunate lesson of late Pentagon chief Donald Rumsfeld, who said if you have a problem, the way to deal with it is to enlarge it, because that'll change the dynamics, hopefully to your advantage. But I'm afraid to say moving from an offensive launch from Ukraine to one launched from the Baltics, from Moldova to Georgia would be opening the gates of hell.
Following up on part of the earlier conversation, West failed to eject Russia from global economy. This is a TASS story. The U.S.-led West has not managed to eject Russia from the global economy, that they will obviously continue to push the country out of its usual markets. Your thoughts, because again, with this economic summit taking place in Central Asia, it looks like the focus is on Central Asia, and the global dynamic is shifting not at a glacial pace, but at breakneck speed.
Well, you are correct. If you look at the last transition, I'm speaking of the rise of that minor monarchy on the fringes of Europe, speaking of England in the 1500s, to the point where about in the middle of the 1600s, it was making a challenge for global dominance and ousting the Spanish and creeping on up on the Ottoman Turks as well. That was an elongated process. I don't think that this current transition is going to be as elongated as happening before our very eyes. And speaking of trying to oust Russia from the world economy, that's more than a notion, as the Germans are finding out to their consternation because of Russia's importance concerning energy, concerning important raw materials like titanium, concerning natural gas as well. And then, once again, because of the alienation of Beijing, you've seen China actually rushing to the defense of Russia, because China recognizes that Russia is a firewall. That is to say, if there was some sort of Hail Mary pass that allowed U.S. imperialism to knock out the current regime in Moscow, that would bring U.S. imperialism ever closer to trying to knock out the regime in Beijing. And so, once again, I think U.S. imperialism has miscalculated, and it's miscalculated in part, as we've stressed before, because it does not take into account all of the opinions of all of the constituencies, not least the constituency in the Black community, which it has sort of coerced, if not bought off, into quiescence.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, a historian, a researcher. He has a lot of books out there. Just go anywhere. The books are sold online. My favorite one is the one about Paul Robeson, but there are plenty good ones. Dr. Gerald Horne.